Hi, everybody. Dr. Kelsey here with KML Academy, where we are anchored in science, guided by intuition, and always personalized for your path. So today, when I was thinking about what should we chat about, I honestly thought it was time in the world to speak about grief. There's a lot of sad things happening. People have been touched by so many tragedies, and I thought that it might be relevant to speak a little bit about grief. And simply by being human, we are going to come in contact with it in our lives. The only way to fully avoid grief is probably to never actually love or be connected to someone or something. So I want to start with what is grief and, when do we experience it? Of course, we think about grief in terms of maybe the loss of another human being, the death of somebody. And that is absolutely the case. And we'll touch on that in just a little bit. But I also want to touch on the fact that it can be beyond that. There can be a loss of a pet, which is sometimes considered to be even more tragic or more difficult for people because pets are part of our families and they are often the most unconditional love that we receive in our lifetimes. There's also can be a loss that can occur from maybe a loss of an identity in your life. Maybe you're shifting and you're in retirement. Maybe you are moving from one career to another, or perhaps you have an ending of a marriage or a partnership. Any one of those things and many more types of things can be considered a loss or grief within somebody's lives. And those losses can impact us in many different ways. Each one of us is going to grieve individually. And that's one thing I want to get across in this video is that grief is not a one-size-fits-all situation. How I might grieve with something might be very different than how you grieve, even if it's the very same situation. Sometimes we might see people laughing and making light of things, and it can be difficult to not judge that and say, well, they must not have cared because they're joking. But that might be simply their way of managing the intense feelings that they're experiencing inside, whereas somebody else might be grieving in sort of a more typical kind of way. Maybe they're teary and they need to take time out of their job or their world for a little bit. So grief is incredibly individualized, and there is no wrong or right way to grieve. And I think that is very important to say, because sometimes we can judge ourselves and feel judged by others if we're not grieving in a expected type of fashion. The next thing that I want to introduce you to is that there actually are people who have studied this incredibly difficult topic. So you might have been exposed to the Kübler-Ross model of grief, even if you're not a psychologist or a therapist. Maybe you've heard of it before. And this particular model kind of breaks down grief or the grieving process into 5 main areas or stages, though Kübler-Ross herself actually shifted this to helping us to think of it not as a stage that we go through linearly, but rather things that generally in the human experience we find that people typically go through when they're grieving. And the first one is called denial, is just what it sounds like. It's almost like oh my gosh, this is not happening to me. Did you have that experience where you said to yourself, no, this can't be right? Your mind can't even necessarily accept it if it's not something that you are prepared for or expecting in your life. And so it can really feel like this is not happening. And then the second one is what we call anger, and kind of this outward expression of that's not fair. Why is this happening to me? A third one is what we call bargaining. So almost a mental sort of gymnastics that we might do in our mind, where we start going back and saying, if only I could do this or I could do that. We start maybe questioning ourselves and wondering if we could have changed the outcome of things, if we maybe shifted our actions in some sort of way. It's also common, the fourth one, to experience depression. So depression is not necessarily just clinical depression. It stands for any deep sadness or hopelessness that we might feel around the loss in our lives. And then the fifth one, and I hesitate to even say this because, it's it's up for discussion in terms of what this means, but it's this idea of acceptance. So eventually learning to live with this new outcome, learning to live with the loss as a part of your life. And that term acceptance, I think, is probably one of the ones that's most confusing to people, because they think that they have to be okay with it. And it means that they no longer need to, once they get to acceptance, they're going to be fine and it's no longer going to impact them, whatever the loss is. And I don't think that's true at all. I mean, you can continue to experience this loss across your lifespan in different ways, but acceptance might even look a little bit like, I'm not okay that this happened, but I'm going to radically accept that I cannot change this, and this is a part of my new reality. These are not stages in the sense that you go from one to the second to the third to the fourth. There is no linear nature to grieving. We weave in and out of these things. Maybe you're in complete denial that this thing happened, and then you're back to anger, and then you're in complete denial again. And eventually, over the course of time, you might get to this new place of radical acceptance where you realize that you're just not that powerful, and this is your new normal. Another thing that I want to talk about related to the science of grief is to understand that grief impacts our biology. It actually causes physical changes in the brain, like the areas of the amygdala, which is that feeling part of your brain. It makes you feel really anxious or sometimes angry. And the prefrontal cortex, which is how we go about regulating our emotions and making decisions. And that should make sense, because think about times where you've been highly charged and emotional in your grief. Your, what we call the emotion mind, which is where the amygdala lives in the limbic system, is probably pretty charged. It's taking the lead, if you will, and it's in the driver's seat. And the logical mind, which is where the prefrontal cortex comes in to regulate, is not as much online as that emotion mind. So it makes it difficult for us to make decisions that are guided either by logic or by intuition, which is the combination of the emotion mind and the logical mind. These are just times to not make massive decisions in your life. Bring in other people who know you, who can help assist you, or make a commitment to yourself that you're not going to make any big decision while you're in this major change of your life. Now, what I also want to note is that there is something called a complicated grief or a prolonged grief. There's probably other words for it as well. And that's when grieving moves from being maybe temporarily very impactful to you to it going outside of that kind of normal time period of adjustment and moving into interfering with your life on many levels, or maybe all levels, over many months or even years. And for some people, their entire rest of their lifetime. Now, that's not the case for most people. For most people, they are going to be what we call, or researchers call, resilient kind of grievers, where they can experience the pain, but they're probably going to adjust to a new sense of stability or reality over time. So what are some evidence-based treatments for grief? Well, the good news is that they do exist. We know that group therapy can be really impactful and helpful, and you can think about that, and it should make sense, because it's an opportunity to feel connection with people, especially if they've gone through the same type of grief that you have. We can also have mindfulness-based therapies that can help focus us on the present moment, help us regulate intense emotions when we're experiencing intense periods of grief. We can have CBT, which helps us process the loss in a little bit different way and looks at our thoughts and our emotions. If trauma is a part of that grieving process, then additional components such as EMDR can be very helpful, and DBT on an individual level can also be really, really helpful. So just so many things we can do, and what I think is so important that I want to get across to you here is that you're not alone. And in the healing process of grief, it's very important to have connection and people around us that can help us realize we are not alone. Also, the way that we grieve can be shaped by our personality, our culture, our past experiences. You know, some people grieve loudly, some people grieve quietly, some people heal in months, some people heal in days, and that is okay. If you're experiencing grief to the point where it is taking you out of your life and it is impacting your ability to be social with others around you or take care of yourself, then that's a time to stop and get some help and make sure that you're bringing in other people around you. I really hope that this video is helpful and that you can leave knowing that you're not broken. You're just human and that you're allowed to take the time that you need, and at the same time, you deserve support in your healing process. KML is always here to support you. I will link our information. Remember, we're available in 42 SciPac states if you do need us. I want to end this video, as I always do, noting that you matter, you deserve, and you're enough.